Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to an era when winter wasn't merely a season marked on calendars, but a formidable adversary that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. We're travelling to the Middle Ages, that vast stretch of European history spanning roughly from the 5th century to the 15th, when surviving the cold months required every ounce of wisdom, preparation, and community cooperation that medieval people could muster. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I hope you're somewhere warm and comfortable, perhaps wrapped in blankets with the gentle sound of rain or wind outside your window. Hold on to that feeling of security and warmth, because the story we're about to explore will take you to a time when such comfort was never guaranteed, when winter's arrival transformed the entire rhythm of life, and when the difference between preparation and negligence could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing in a medieval village as autumn begins its slow surrender to winter. The year might be 1250, or perhaps 1350. The exact date matters less than the universal experience that medieval people across centuries shared when facing the approach of the cold season. You're surrounded by the earthy smell of freshly turned soil, the sharp tang of wood smoke curling from cottage chimneys, and the underlying anxiety that permeates every conversation, every gesture, every decision made during these crucial transitional weeks. The medieval understanding of winter was fundamentally different from our modern conception. We view winter as an inconvenience, perhaps, or even a season of beauty and recreation. We adjust our thermostats, visit grocery stores stocked year-round with produce from around the world, and rarely face genuine threats to our survival because of cold weather. But for medieval Europeans, winter was a trial by ordeal that returned with terrifying regularity every single year. It was a season that killed the weak, the unprepared, and sometimes even the careful and prudent. It was nature's most consistent reminder that human beings lived at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. The medieval relationship with winter shaped everything about their society. Their architecture, their agricultural practices, their social hierarchies, their religious observances, their diet, their clothing, their very concept of time itself, all evolved in response to the annual challenge of surviving months of cold, darkness, and scarcity. Understanding how medieval people prepared for and endured winter gives us profound insight into their entire way of life, revealing the ingenuity, resilience, and community bonds that characterized medieval European society. What's remarkable about medieval winter survival is how it varied dramatically across different regions, social classes, and time periods within the Middle Ages themselves. A wealthy lord in a stone castle faced different challenges than a peasant farmer in a wooden cottage. A merchant family in a crowded medieval city navigated winter differently than a monastic community in a remote monastery. A family living in northern Scandinavia employed strategies unknown to their counterparts in Mediterranean regions. Yet certain fundamental principles and practices connected all these diverse experiences, creating patterns of preparation and survival that defined the medieval approach to winter. The story we're about to explore isn't just about suffering and hardship, though those elements were certainly present. It's also a story about human adaptability and creativity, about communities coming together to support their most vulnerable members, about the development of technologies and techniques that would influence European culture for centuries to come. It's about the festivals and celebrations that medieval people created to maintain hope and joy during the darkest months. It's about the ways that winter shaped medieval spirituality, economics, and social relationships in profound and lasting ways. As we move through this exploration, we'll examine the practical realities of medieval winter survival in rich detail. We'll discuss how people prepared their homes and stored food during the precious autumn months. We'll explore the architecture and heating methods that protected families from deadly cold. We'll investigate the clothing and textiles that provided essential insulation. We'll look at the social structures and community practices that distributed resources and supported those in need. We'll examine the role of the medieval church in providing both spiritual comfort and practical assistance during winter's trials. And we'll consider how periodic catastrophic winters, those exceptional seasons of extreme cold or repeated crop failures, tested medieval society to its very limits. Throughout this journey, we'll ground our exploration in historical evidence drawn from archaeological findings, contemporary medieval documents, scholarly research, and the accumulated knowledge of historians who have dedicated their careers to understanding medieval daily life. We'll distinguish carefully between what we know with certainty and what remains speculation, honouring both the historical record and the limitations of our knowledge about periods so distant from our own time. So settle in more comfortably now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow the concerns of your own day to drift away like autumn leaves carried on a cold wind. We're about to spend the next few hours exploring a world that existed centuries ago. A world where winter was both enemy and teacher, where survival required wisdom passed down through generations, and where the arrival of spring was never merely a seasonal change but a genuine triumph of human endurance over nature's most persistent challenge. The medieval winter awaits us, with all its hardships and all its unexpected beauties, with its tales of suffering and its examples of remarkable human resilience. Let's begin our exploration of how people survived winter in the Middle Ages. The medieval period experienced what climate historians now call the medieval warm period, which lasted roughly from 950 to 1250, followed by the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which extended from approximately 1300 to 1850. These climatic variations had profound impacts on how people experienced and survived winter throughout the Middle Ages. Understanding this climatic context is essential for appreciating the challenges medieval people faced and the strategies they developed in response. During the medieval warm period, temperatures across Europe were generally warmer than the centuries that preceded and followed. This warming trend enabled agricultural expansion into marginal lands that had previously been too cold for reliable cultivation. Vikings established settlements in Greenland and even reached North America during this period, made possible by more favourable sailing conditions and somewhat less severe winters in the North Atlantic region. Vineyards flourished in England, producing wine grapes much further north than would be possible in later centuries. The growing season lengthened, allowing for more productive harvests that supported population growth and the expansion of towns and cities across Europe. But even during this relatively warm period, winters remained formidable challenges for medieval people. The term warm is relative when discussing medieval climate. Winters were still cold enough to freeze rivers and ponds solid, to make travel treacherous or impossible for months at a time, to threaten livestock and humans alike with hypothermia and frostbite. The medieval warm period simply meant that these challenges were somewhat less severe and less unpredictable than they would become during the Little Ice Age that followed. The transition toward colder conditions began gradually during the 13th century, then accelerated dramatically in the early 14th century. This cooling trend brought longer, harsher winters that tested medieval society in unprecedented ways. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, one of the worst subsistence crises in medieval European history, was partly caused by a series of exceptionally cold, wet summers that ruined harvests, followed by brutal winters that depleted food stores and killed livestock. This catastrophic period demonstrated just how vulnerable medieval populations were to climatic variations they could neither predict nor control. Medieval people had no scientific understanding of climate change or weather patterns in the modern sense. They lacked thermometers, barometers, or any instruments for measuring meteorological conditions objectively. Yet they possessed deep observational knowledge passed down through generations, accumulated wisdom about signs that predicted weather changes and seasonal transitions. They watched animal behavior with attention that modern people rarely maintain. Birds migrating earlier or later than usual, squirrels gathering nuts with unusual intensity, cattle growing thicker coats than normal. All these observations informed medieval predictions about the severity of the approaching winter. They studied plant growth patterns with equal care. Trees producing exceptionally heavy crops of acorns, berries, or other fruits suggested to medieval observers that nature was preparing for an especially difficult winter. The thickness of onion skins, the abundance of spider webs in late autumn, the date when first frost arrived, all these natural phenomena were interpreted as messages about what winter would bring. While these folk predictions lacked scientific basis, they represented serious attempts by medieval people to anticipate and prepare for the challenges ahead. The medieval calendar itself reflected the profound importance of seasonal transitions. The liturgical year of the medieval church was structured around agricultural seasons and the cycle of sowing and harvest, reflecting the intimate connection between spiritual life and physical survival. Michaelmas, celebrated on September 29th, marked a crucial transition point in the medieval year. This feast day traditionally signalled the end of harvest season and the beginning of preparations for winter. It was a time for paying rents, settling accounts, and beginning the serious work of storing food and securing shelter for the cold months ahead. All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd represented another significant marker in the medieval calendar. These observances acknowledge the approach of winter's darkness and death, commemorating those who had died while also celebrating the communion of saints who provided spiritual protection during dangerous times. The proximity of these religious observances to the old Celtic festival of Samhain, which marked the beginning of winter in pre-Christian tradition, suggests how deeply the seasonal cycle was embedded in European cultural consciousness across different belief systems and historical periods. The Feast of St. Martin on November 11th was particularly significant for medieval winter preparation. This date traditionally marked the slaughter of livestock that couldn't be supported through winter months, a practical necessity that was transformed into a festive occasion. Martin Mass, as it was known, featured communal feasting on fresh meat before the serious privations of winter set in. The timing wasn't arbitrary, but based on practical considerations. By mid-November, the autumn grazing had ended, but winter cold had arrived, providing natural refrigeration that helped preserve slaughtered meat without the expense of precious salt. Medieval people conceptualized the year differently than we do in modern times. Rather than viewing 12 months as roughly equivalent units, they understood the year as divided into distinct seasons with profoundly different characteristics and requirements. Winter, known in Old English as winter, or in various regional dialects as hiver, inverno or invierno, wasn't simply a quarter of the year, but a distinct period that demanded entirely different modes of living, working, and thinking compared to the productive seasons of spring, summer, and autumn. The medieval day itself changed dramatically between summer and winter. Without artificial lighting beyond candles and rushlights, both expensive and dim by modern standards, medieval people lived according to daylight hours to an extent that's difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. In summer, the working day might extend from dawn around 4 in the morning to dusk around 9 in the evening, providing 15 or more hours of productive time. In winter, the same latitude might see dawn arrive at 8 in the morning and darkness fall by 4 in the afternoon, leaving only 8 hours of adequate light for outdoor work. This dramatic seasonal variation in daylight hours meant that winter fundamentally altered the rhythm of medieval life. The pace of work slowed not from laziness, but from practical necessity. Many outdoor tasks simply couldn't be performed in darkness or during the worst weather. The long winter evenings, which might extend from mid-afternoon to the following morning, were periods of confinement when families gathered around whatever heat sources they possessed, engaging in indoor tasks that could be performed by candlelight or firelight while conserving energy and staying warm. Medieval people understood that winter cold posed direct threats to human survival that went far beyond mere discomfort. Hypothermia, though they didn't know it by that name, killed people every winter. The elderly, the very young and the sick were particularly vulnerable to cold that penetrated inadequate housing and insufficient clothing. Frostbite damaged extremities, sometimes requiring amputation to prevent deadly infections. The medieval medical understanding of cold's effects was limited by their general theory of humours and imbalances, but they recognized from painful experience that prolonged exposure to cold could be fatal. They also understood, based on accumulated observation rather than scientific theory, that winter brought increased risk of certain illnesses. Respiratory infections that we now understand to be caused by viruses spread more easily when people crowded together in enclosed spaces for warmth. Malnutrition during late winter and early spring, when stored food supplies ran low, weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to disease. Medieval people couldn't explain these patterns in terms of germs or nutrition science, but they recognized the seasonal patterns of illness and death that winter reliably brought. The psychological impact of winter darkness and confinement also affected medieval people, though they lacked modern vocabulary for discussing mental health. Contemporary sources occasionally mention melancholy or despondency associated with winter's privations, suggesting that medieval people experienced what we might now recognize as seasonal affective disorder. The medieval response to this psychological challenge was primarily communal and religious rather than medical, emphasizing feast days, community gatherings, and spiritual observances designed to maintain hope and social cohesion during the darkest months. Regional variations in winter severity were enormous across medieval Europe. A family living in northern Scotland faced winters dramatically different from those experienced by families in southern Spain or Italy. Scandinavian winters brought months of near-total darkness in the far north, along with temperatures that regularly dropped far below freezing. By contrast, Mediterranean winters, while cooler and wetter than summer months, rarely brought the life-threatening cold that characterized northern regions. These regional differences shaped local cultures, architectures, and survival strategies in profound ways. Northern European building techniques emphasized insulation and heat retention to a degree unnecessary in southern regions. Scandinavian and northern Germanic peoples developed specialized skills in working with ice and snow, creating storage facilities that used winter cold as an asset rather than simply a threat. Mediterranean peoples, facing milder but wetter winters, developed different architectural solutions focused on managing moisture and maintaining comfort during rainy seasons rather than extreme cold. The Alpine regions of Central Europe presented unique challenges. Mountain communities dealt with heavy snowfall that could isolate villages for weeks or months at a time, requiring exceptional levels of advanced preparation and self-sufficiency. Avalanche risk posed dangers unknown to lowland communities. The shorter growing seasons at higher elevations meant that mountain communities had less time to produce food supplies and longer winters during which those supplies had to last. Coastal communities throughout Europe experienced winter differently than inland populations. Maritime climates moderated temperature extremes, preventing the most severe cold while also bringing wet, windy conditions that penetrated clothing and housing. Fishing communities faced the additional challenge that winter storms made their primary livelihood dangerous or impossible for extended periods, requiring alternative survival strategies during months when the sea was too treacherous for small boats. Medieval people also recognized that individual winters varied dramatically in severity within the same location. A mild winter might bring relatively little snow and only occasional freezing temperatures, allowing outdoor work to continue intermittently throughout the season. A severe winter might bring weeks of unbroken cold, heavy snow that blocked roads and isolated communities, and ice that persisted from November through March. These variations couldn't be predicted reliably in advance, adding an element of uncertainty to winter preparation that complicated planning and resource allocation. The accumulated experience of surviving multiple winters created a body of traditional knowledge that was transmitted orally from generation to generation. Grandparents taught grandchildren the signs that predicted harsh winters, the techniques for preserving food most effectively, the methods for staying warm with minimal fuel, the prayers and practices that provided spiritual comfort during difficult times. This intergenerational transmission of survival knowledge was essential for community continuity, as each generation built upon the hard-won wisdom of their ancestors, while also adapting to the specific conditions of their own time. Written records from medieval monasteries occasionally preserved observations about exceptional winters, providing modern historians with glimpses of how medieval people experienced and responded to climatic variations. Chronicles note when rivers froze solid enough for markets to be held on the ice, when spring arrived unusually early or late, when harvests failed due to weather-related disasters. These written sources, while invaluable, represent only a tiny fraction of the lived experience of medieval winters, as most people were illiterate and their daily struggles left no written record for historians to study. Archaeological evidence supplements written sources by revealing the physical traces of how medieval people prepared for and survived winter. excavations of medieval homes reveal heating systems, storage facilities, and architectural features designed to cope with cold weather. Analysis of food remains found in medieval sites shows what people ate during winter months and how diet changed seasonally. Study of medieval clothing and textiles recovered from archaeological contexts demonstrates the sophisticated techniques medieval people developed for staying warm. The medieval understanding of winter was thus a complex combination of practical observation, accumulated traditional knowledge, religious interpretation, and direct physical experience repeated annually throughout their lives. They couldn't control the weather or predict seasonal severity with modern accuracy, but they developed sophisticated strategies for preparing, adapting, and surviving based on centuries of hard-won wisdom. Their relationship with winter was intimate and immediate in ways that most modern people, insulated by central heating and global food supply chains, can barely imagine. As autumn's colours faded and the first frost glazed the fields with crystalline white, medieval communities entered the most critical period of the entire year. The weeks between the final harvest, typically completed by late September or early October, and the arrival of serious winter weather in November or December, represented a desperate race against time. Every task that could be completed during these precious weeks might mean the difference between comfortable survival and desperate hunger, between staying warm and suffering from cold, between life and death for the most vulnerable members of the community. The harvest itself, culminating in late summer and early autumn, was medieval society's most important event. The success or failure of the grain harvest determined whether the community would face the coming winter with confidence or dread. A successful harvest meant adequate bread through the winter months, seed grain for spring planting, and perhaps even surplus that could be sold to generate income for other necessities. A failed harvest, by contrast, meant facing winter knowing that food would run short before spring, that the weakest members of the community might not survive, that the entire social order might be tested by scarcity and desperation. Once the grain was safely stored in barns and granaries, attention shifted immediately to a cascade of other preparations that had to be completed before winter's arrival. Time became the most precious commodity, more valuable than gold, as every productive hour had to be invested in tasks that would pay dividends throughout the long, cold months ahead. The slaughter of livestock was one of the most significant autumn activities, requiring careful calculation and considerable skill. Medieval families couldn't afford to feed all their animals through the winter months. Fodder, primarily hay and grains, was too valuable to be consumed by animals that wouldn't serve essential purposes during winter. Therefore, difficult decisions had to be made about which animals would be kept alive and which would be slaughtered for their meat. Breeding animals, the cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens needed to replenish herds and flocks in spring had to be preserved regardless of the fodder cost. Working oxen or horses, essential for ploughing and transport, also had to be maintained despite the expense. Milking cows that would provide dairy products through winter received high priority, but all other animals, particularly the young males that had been born during spring and fattened during summer grazing, were candidates for autumn slaughter. This mass slaughter typically occurred in November, timed to coincide with the first serious cold that would help preserve the meat. The Feast of St. Martin on November 11th became strongly associated with this practice. transforming a practical necessity into a communal celebration. Families gathered to assist each other with the heavy labor of slaughter, butchering, and initial meat preservation. The air in medieval villages during this period would have been thick with the smell of blood, burning fat, and the smoke from fires used to cure meat. Every part of the slaughtered animal was utilized with efficiency that modern industrial meat processing rarely achieves. The meat itself was preserved through multiple methods, each suitable for different cuts and intended uses. The finest cuts might be salted and hung in cool, dry locations where they would cure slowly throughout winter. Salt was expensive, representing a significant investment for most medieval families, so its use was reserved for meat that was expected to last the longest or had the highest value. Smoking was another crucial preservation method, particularly for pork. Smokehouses, small outbuildings, or designated areas where meat could be suspended above smouldering fires filled medieval villages during November and December. The smoke had to be carefully managed, hot enough to cook the meat partially and dry it effectively, but not so hot that it would simply cook rather than preserve. Different woods imparted different flavors and preservation qualities. Hardwoods like oak and hickory were prized for their slow, steady burning and pleasant taste. Fat from slaughtered animals was rendered into lard, a precious commodity that served multiple purposes throughout winter. Lard provided cooking fat, which was essential for preparing many foods and added crucial calories to the medieval winter diet. It could be used to preserve other foods by sealing them in airtight containers. It served as fuel for lamps, providing light during the long, dark evenings. It had medicinal applications, being used as a base for salves and ointments. Nothing was wasted. Intestines were cleaned thoroughly and used as casings for sausages, another important form of meat preservation. Sausage making allowed smaller scraps and organ meats to be mixed with grain, herbs, and spices, then stuffed into casings and smoked or dried for long-term storage. Different regions developed distinctive sausage recipes that reflected local tastes and available ingredients. Hides were processed into leather, a multi-stage operation that required considerable skill and time. Fresh hides had to be fleshed, removing all remaining tissue, then treated with salt or by being stretched and dried to prevent decay. Tanning, the process of turning raw hide into durable leather, took weeks or months and involved soaking hides in solutions made from tree bark, particularly oak, which contained tannins that chemically altered the hide structure. The resulting leather could be used for shoes, clothing, bags, straps, and countless other purposes essential for medieval life. Bones were saved for making soup stock, providing nutritious broth throughout winter. They could also be carved into tools, buttons, needles, and other useful implements. Hooves were boiled down to extract collagen, which could be used as glue. Even blood was utilized, being mixed with grain and fat to create blood puddings or sausages that provided nutrition that medieval people couldn't afford to waste. While animal slaughter and meat preservation proceeded, other crucial food preparation activities competed for attention and labor. Root vegetables, harvested in autumn, had to be properly stored to prevent spoiling during winter months. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets were buried in underground pits or stored in cool cellars, layered with straw or sand to prevent freezing while maintaining enough humidity to keep them from drying out. These vegetables would provide essential vitamins and variety to the winter diet, when fresh produce was entirely unavailable. Cabbages were pickled or made into sauerkraut through fermentation, a process that not only preserved the vegetables, but actually enhanced their nutritional value by creating beneficial bacteria. The same fermentation technique was applied to other vegetables, creating preserved foods that could last months while providing some protection against scurvy and other vitamin deficiency diseases. Though medieval people didn't understand the nutritional science involved. Apples, one of the few fruits that could be stored relatively successfully through winter, received special attention. Some were dried, a labor-intensive process that involved slicing the fruit thin and placing it in the sun or near fires until most moisture was removed. Dried apples could last through winter and into the following summer if stored properly. Other apples were carefully packed in straw in cool, dry storage areas where the best specimens might remain edible until late winter or early spring. Nuts, particularly walnuts, chestnuts, and hazelnuts, were gathered from forests and woodlands. These provided valuable nutrition, being high in fats and proteins that were often scarce in the medieval winter diet. Nuts could be stored successfully for months if kept dry and protected from rodents, making them precious winter foods that supplemented the monotonous diet of grain-based foods that dominated most people's meals. Grain storage required careful attention to prevent the catastrophic losses that could result from moisture, mold, or vermin. Threshing and winnowing had to be completed thoroughly to remove all chaff and ensure that only clean, dry grain was stored. Granaries had to be swept clean, repaired of any holes where mice or rats could enter, and sometimes fumigated with smoke or strong-smelling herbs to discourage pests. The grain itself might be stored in various containers depending on the household's wealth and resources. Wealthy families used wooden chests or barrels, sometimes lined with clay or sealed with pitch to create airtight environments. Poorer families might store grain in woven baskets, cloth bags, or even large pottery vessels. Regardless of the container, the grain had to be monitored throughout winter for signs of moisture or pest infestation, with affected grain quickly removed before problems could spread to the entire supply. Firewood collection was another essential autumn activity that couldn't be neglected. A typical medieval household required enormous amounts of wood to maintain fires for cooking and heating throughout the 4 to 6 months of cold weather. Estimates suggest that a single household might need several cords of wood, each cord representing a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long, to survive a normal winter comfortably. Collecting this much wood required weeks of labor. Dead wood could be gathered from forests where communities had traditional rights to take fallen timber, but this easy source was often depleted early in autumn by multiple families competing for the same limited resource. Therefore, families also had to cut green wood, which required permission from whoever controlled the woodland, whether that was a local lord, monastery, or communal village authority. Green wood, freshly cut, contained too much moisture to burn efficiently, so it had to be split and stacked in locations where air could circulate around it, allowing it to dry for several weeks or months before use. The driest wood was saved for cooking, where efficient heat was essential, while greener wood might be used for long-lasting fires that provided warmth overnight. Different types of wood served different purposes. Hardwoods like oak, ash, and beech burned hot and long, making them valuable for both cooking and heating. Softwoods like pine and fir ignited easily and burned hot initially, making them useful for starting fires, but they burned quickly and produced more smoke. Medieval families learned these distinctions through experience and allocated their wood supplies strategically based on each type's properties. Preparing housing for winter required attention to numerous details. Gaps between wooden planks in walls or around windows had to be sealed with whatever materials were available, typically mud mixed with straw, moss, or old cloth. These chinking materials had to be replaced or refreshed annually, as winter weather, rain, and wind gradually degraded them. Thatched roofs needed inspection and repair. Missing or damaged thatch allowed rain and snow to penetrate into living spaces, creating miserable conditions and potentially damaging stored food. Fresh bundles of thatch had to be woven into existing roofing where needed. Work that required climbing onto roofs during autumn's increasingly cold and windy weather. Shutters for windows had to be repaired or reinforced. Few medieval peasant homes had glass windows, which were extremely expensive and found mainly in churches and wealthy households. Instead, windows were simple openings that might be covered with shutters during cold weather, trading light for warmth. These shutters had to be in good repair and fit tightly to provide maximum protection against winter winds. Chimneys and flues, where they existed, needed cleaning to prevent dangerous fires from soot accumulation. Many medieval homes didn't have true chimneys, but used simple holes in the roof or walls to vent smoke from central hearths. These openings still needed maintenance to ensure they functioned properly without allowing excessive heat loss. The autumn preparation period was also the time for community-level activities that benefited everyone. Mills that ground grain into flour needed maintenance before winter weather made repairs difficult. Bridges and roads needed whatever repairs were feasible before winter weather made travel dangerous. Wells and communal water sources had to be checked and maintained, as winter freezing could damage structures and contaminate water supplies. Communities also made preparations for their most vulnerable members. The medieval social system, for all its inequalities and hardships, generally included mechanisms for ensuring that widows, orphans, and the elderly poor wouldn't simply be left to starve during winter. These preparations might include storing extra grain in church or manor facilities that could be distributed to those in need, arranging for elderly or infirm people to be taken into the homes of relatives or community members who could provide care, or organising communal work parties to help those who couldn't complete their own winter preparations without assistance. Religious institutions, particularly monasteries, played crucial roles in autumn preparation. Monastic communities typically had more resources, better storage facilities, and more organised approaches to winter preparation than individual households. They stored extra food that could be distributed to the poor during winter months, maintained hospitals that provided care for the sick, and offered shelter to travellers caught by winter weather. The autumn months saw intensive activity as monks and nuns prepared not just for their own needs, but for the charitable obligations that Christian teaching imposed upon them. The psychological dimension of autumn preparation was as important as the physical work. Medieval people understood that the quality of their winter experience depended directly on the thoroughness of their autumn preparations. This knowledge created intense pressure to accomplish everything necessary during the short window of opportunity before winter's arrival. Family arguments over priorities, anxiety about whether preparations were adequate, and exhaustion from relentless labour all characterised this period. Yet there was also satisfaction in completing preparations successfully, in looking at well-stocked larders, neatly stacked firewood, and well-maintained housing, knowing that the family had done everything possible to ensure survival through the coming months. This satisfaction was often expressed through communal celebrations, particularly around Martinmas and other autumn festivals, where communities gathered to share food, drink, and companionship before winter's isolation set in. The transition from autumn preparation to winter survival happened gradually rather than all at once. The first hard freeze might come in late October or early November, bringing a visible end to outdoor growing and forcing final harvest activities. The first significant snowfall, which might arrive weeks earlier or later depending on the year and location, marked another threshold. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year around December 21st, represented the climactic moment when darkness reached its maximum, and the slow return towards spring finally began, though the coldest weather typically lay weeks or months ahead. By the time winter had truly settled in, usually by late December or early January, the frantic activity of autumn had necessarily slowed. The work of preparation was complete, for better or worse, and medieval families settled into the very different rhythms and challenges of winter survival, sustained by the food they had stored, the fuel they had collected, and the preparations they had made during those crucial autumn weeks. Food preservation and storage represented perhaps the most critical challenge facing medieval families preparing for winter. Unlike modern people who can purchase fresh produce year-round from global supply chains, supported by refrigeration and rapid transportation, medieval Europeans had to make their autumn harvest last through 4 to 6 months of winter and into the following spring when fresh food would again become available. The techniques they developed represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, regional variations adapted to local conditions and available resources, and continuous innovation in response to the eternal challenge of preventing spoilage and waste. The preservation of meat, already mentioned in the context of autumn slaughter, employed multiple techniques that could be used in combination for optimal results. Salting was the most common method, but required considerable quantities of salt, which was expensive and not equally available throughout medieval Europe. Coastal regions had access to sea salt produced by evaporating seawater in shallow ponds, a process that had been used since ancient times. Inland regions, particularly those near salt mines or salt springs, also had access to rock salt, though transportation costs could make it expensive for people living far from these sources. The process of salting meat was relatively straightforward, but required attention to detail. The meat was cut into manageable pieces and rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt, ensuring that every surface was covered. The salted meat was then packed tightly into barrels or wooden boxes, with additional layers of salt between each layer of meat. The salt drew moisture out of the meat through osmosis, creating an environment too dry for most bacteria to survive. The extracted moisture, laden with salt and meat juices, would accumulate at the bottom of the container and had to be drained periodically. After several weeks of this dry salting process, the meat would have lost much of its original moisture and would be thoroughly permeated with salt. It could then be removed from the barrel, brushed free of excess salt, and hung in a cool, dry location where it would continue to age and cure throughout winter. When needed, pieces of this salt meat would be cut off and soaked in multiple changes of water to remove excess salt before cooking. The result was tough, salty meat that bore little resemblance to fresh flesh, but provided essential protein and calories when no other source was available. Brining represented a variation on dry salting, where meat was submerged in a solution of salt water, often with the addition of sugar, saltpeter, and various spices. The brine had to be strong enough to preserve the meat, typically requiring about 2 pounds of salt per gallon of water, and the meat had to remain fully submerged throughout the preservation period. Wooden barrels filled with meat and brine became standard features in medieval larders and storerooms. Smoking meat complemented salting by adding antimicrobial compounds from wood smoke, while also creating a protective outer layer that slowed additional bacterial growth. The smoking process required careful temperature control. Cold smoking, performed at temperatures below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, preserved meat without cooking it, allowing it to retain more moisture and tenderness while gaining the preservative benefits of smoke exposure. This process might take days or even weeks of continuous or repeated smoking. Hot smoking, performed at temperatures between 100 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit, partially cooked the meat while smoking it, creating a product that was ready to eat but didn't last quite as long in storage as cold-smoked meat. Medieval smokehouses were typically small structures, sometimes merely heavy cloth tents suspended over smouldering fires, designed to contain smoke around the hanging meat, while preventing excessive heat that could cook rather than preserve. Drying meat through air exposure represented another preservation technique, particularly useful in dry climates or during periods of dry autumn weather. Thin strips of meat could be hung in areas with good air circulation, where they would gradually lose moisture until they became hard and leathery. This jerky, as later cultures would call it, was lightweight, didn't require salt, and could last for months if kept dry. However, it required consistent dry conditions that weren't always available in medieval Europe's often damp climate. Fish preservation followed similar principles but adapted to the specific characteristics of aquatic products. Coastal communities, particularly those in Scandinavia, Britain and the Baltic region, developed sophisticated fish preservation industries that supplied protein to inland populations throughout winter. Cod, herring, and other fish were caught in vast quantities during autumn fishing seasons when fish congregated for spawning, providing opportunities for mass harvesting. Salted herring became one of the most important preserved foods in medieval Europe, so significant that the herring trade shaped political alliances and economic development across the continent. The fish were gutted, packed tightly in barrels with coarse salt, and could then be transported long distances inland where they provided affordable protein for poor families throughout winter. Stockfish, unsalted fish, dried hard as wood through air exposure, represented another major preserved fish product, particularly associated with Norwegian fishing industries that sent dried cod to markets throughout Europe. Dairy products presented different preservation challenges because milk spoils rapidly without refrigeration. Medieval families addressed this by transforming fresh milk into products with longer storage lives. Butter could be preserved for months by packing it tightly into barrels or pottery crocks with salt, creating a product that was quite different from fresh butter, but remained edible and nutritious throughout winter. Cheese, produced through the controlled fermentation of milk, came in countless regional varieties reflecting different milk sources, cow, sheep, or goat, different bacterial cultures, and different aging processes. Hard cheeses, aged for months or years, could last through winter and beyond, providing concentrated nutrition from relatively small volumes. Soft cheeses had shorter storage lives but could still extend the usefulness of milk far beyond its natural spoilage time. Vegetable preservation employed techniques adapted to each plant type's specific characteristics. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, parsnips, beets, and onions could be stored successfully in cool, humid conditions that prevented freezing while slowing decay. Underground pits lined with straw and covered with soil and more straw for insulation created natural cold storage that maintained temperatures just above freezing throughout winter. These storage pits had to be located in well-drained areas where groundwater wouldn't flood them, yet remained accessible even when snow covered the ground. Some households dug small pits beneath their living spaces, creating cellars that benefited from heat leaking down from above while remaining cool enough for effective storage. Larger, wealthier households might have purpose-built cellars or storage buildings designed specifically for winter food storage. Cabbage preservation relied on fermentation rather than cold storage. The process of making sauerkraut involved shredding cabbage finely, mixing it with salt, and packing it tightly into barrels or crocks, where natural bacteria would ferment the sugars in the cabbage into lactic acid. This acid created an environment hostile to spoilage organisms, while also developing complex flavors and actually enhancing the nutritional value of the cabbage by making certain nutrients more bioavailable and adding beneficial probiotics. The fermentation process took several weeks, during which the containers had to be monitored to ensure that the cabbage remained submerged beneath its own juices, which were pressed out by the salt and the weight of the packed vegetable. Properly fermented sauerkraut could last many months, providing vitamin C that helped prevent scurvy during late winter when other fresh foods were exhausted. Fruit preservation was more challenging than vegetable preservation, because fruits contained higher sugar levels that promoted fermentation and spoilage. Apples and pears, being relatively firm and naturally resistant to decay, could be stored in cool, dark conditions for several months if carefully monitored and any spoiling fruit quickly removed before mold could spread. They were typically wrapped individually in cloth or paper and packed in boxes with straw or similar material to prevent bruising and provide insulation. Drying fruit was more reliable for long-term storage. Apples, pears, plums, and other fruits could be sliced thin and dried in the sun during autumn days or near fires in enclosed spaces. The drying process removed enough moisture to prevent bacterial growth while concentrating sugars and flavors. Dried fruit was considerably less appealing than fresh, but remained edible for many months and could be reconstituted in water or cooked in porridges and other dishes. Making preserves by cooking fruit with honey, or, for wealthy households, expensive imported sugar-created products that could last through winter. The high concentration of sugar in properly made preserves prevented bacterial growth through osmotic pressure, just as salt did in preserved meat. However, honey was expensive and sugar even more so, making fruit preserves luxuries that only relatively wealthy families could produce in any quantity. Herbs for cooking and medicine were harvested in late summer and autumn, then dried by hanging in bunches in warm, airy locations. Once thoroughly dried, they could be stored in cloth bags or pottery containers, providing flavoring for monotonous winter foods and ingredients for medicinal preparations throughout the cold months. Different herbs required different harvesting and drying techniques to preserve their volatile oils and therapeutic properties, grain storage, while not preservation in the same sense as transforming fresh meat or vegetables, nonetheless required careful technique to maintain quality throughout winter and into spring. Grain had to be threshed to separate kernels from straw, winnowed to remove chaff, and thoroughly dried before storage to prevent mold growth. Even with careful preparation, stored grain remained vulnerable to moisture infiltration, which could cause sprouting or mold, and to rodents and insects that could destroy or contaminate supplies. Medieval granaries employed various strategies to protect stored grain. Raised floors prevented moisture from rising from the ground, while also making it harder for rodents to access the grain. Thick walls provided insulation against temperature fluctuations. Small windows provided ventilation that prevented moisture accumulation, while also allowing cats, which medieval people valued highly for their role in rodent control, to hunt mice and rats that attempted to invade the storage areas. Some communities developed communal grain storage facilities, typically associated with monasteries or manor houses, where larger quantities could be stored under better protection than individual families could provide. These facilities also served social functions by allowing the community to maintain strategic reserves that could be distributed during emergencies or used to support members who had lost their private supplies to fire, flood, or other disasters. The transition from food preservation to food preparation during winter required its own body of knowledge. Preserved foods often required soaking, boiling, or other processing before they were palatable. Salt meat had to be soaked for hours or days with multiple changes of water to remove enough salt to make the meat edible. Dried vegetables and fruits needed reconstitution in water before they could be incorporated into dishes. Hard cheese had to be shaved or grated because it was too firm to bite into directly. Medieval cooks developed recipes and techniques specifically adapted to working with preserved foods. Thick pottages, essentially heavy soups or stews, became winter staples because they could incorporate small amounts of preserved meat or fish, dried vegetables, grains, and seasonings into nutritious one-pot meals that maximized the value of limited ingredients, while also being cooked over fires that provided essential heat. The social organization of food storage reflected medieval hierarchical society. Lords stored massive quantities of food in castle and manor house facilities, not just to feed their own families, but to supply the numerous servants, soldiers, and craftsmen who formed their households. Monasteries maintained large stores to feed their communities and provide charity to the poor. Wealthy merchant families in towns had storage facilities that allowed them to stockpile food during harvest season when prices were low, then rely on these stores during winter rather than purchasing food at inflated prices. Peasant families had much smaller storage facilities and had to be much more careful about their limited supplies, knowing that if their food ran out before spring, they would have to purchase additional supplies at whatever prices the market demanded, potentially falling into debt that could take years to repay. This economic pressure made food preservation and storage skills absolutely essential for household survival and economic stability. The end of winter storage supplies in late winter or early spring represented one of the most dangerous periods in the medieval year. By March or April, even well-prepared families might be running low on stored foods. The last of the salt meat might be consumed. Root cellars might yield only spoiled or sprouted vegetables. Grain supplies approached exhaustion. Yet spring planting couldn't begin until after the last frost, and the first harvest of new food wouldn't arrive until late spring or early summer, creating a gap that tested every family's resourcefulness and resilience. This late winter period, sometimes called the Hungry Gap, saw increased mortality, particularly among the very young, the elderly, and those already weakened by illness. Medieval people adapted by seeking wild foods, early spring greens, roots and tubers that could be dug from forests, fish from rivers and ponds that became more active as water temperatures rose. They stretched remaining supplies through increasingly diluted pottages, by mixing grain flour with ground acorns or other normally undesirable fillers, by accepting hunger as an unavoidable reality of seasonal existence. The success or failure of food preservation and storage strategies determined not just comfort levels during winter, but fundamental survival outcomes for medieval families and communities. This knowledge was passed down through generations, refined through experience, and adapted to local conditions and available resources, creating a sophisticated body of practical wisdom that sustained European populations through countless difficult winters. The architecture and heating systems of medieval homes reflected centuries of adaptation to winter conditions, with designs varying dramatically based on geography, social class, and available building materials. Understanding how medieval people created and maintained warm shelter during the coldest months reveals both the ingenuity of their solutions and the harsh realities they faced when those solutions proved inadequate. The typical peasant dwelling in much of medieval Europe was a modest structure that would shock modern sensibilities with its apparent inadequacy. In England and much of northwestern Europe, these homes were often built using a technique called wattle and daub. Vertical wooden posts formed the structural frame, with horizontal wooden strips woven between them like basketwork. This wattle framework was then plastered with daub, a mixture of wet soil, clay, sand, straw, and sometimes animal dung, which dried to create walls that provided some insulation and protection from weather. These wattle and daub walls were far from weatherproof by modern standards. Cracks developed as the daub dried and as the building settled, allowing cold air to penetrate freely. Rain could soften and erode the daub, requiring regular maintenance and repair. Wind found countless pathways through gaps and imperfections. Yet these structures represented the best that most peasant families could construct, with available resources and labour, and they survived in countless thousands across the medieval landscape. The roof structure typically consisted of wooden rafters covered with thatch, bundles of straw, reeds, or other plant materials layered thickly to shed rain and provide some insulation. A well-maintained thatched roof, perhaps 18 inches thick or more, could actually provide excellent insulation when dry, trapping air between the layers of vegetation. However, thatch required constant maintenance, as wind, rain, birds, and rodents all contributed to its gradual deterioration. Wet thatch lost much of its insulating value and could harbour mould and pests. The floor in most peasant homes was simply packed earth, sometimes mixed with animal blood or other materials to create a harder surface. Wealthy families might have wooden plank floors, and the very wealthy might even have stone or tile floors, but the vast majority of medieval people lived with dirt floors that became muddy during wet weather, and that provided no insulation from ground cold during winter. Windows in peasant homes were minimal or non-existent. Glass was an extreme luxury far beyond the means of ordinary people, so any windows were simply openings in walls that could be covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or animal bladders scraped thin enough to admit some light. During winter, These openings were typically sealed completely with shutters, trading any benefit of daylight for essential heat retention. The door, often the only entrance to the home, represented a constant source of heat loss. Medieval doors were typically made of wooden planks, often poorly fitted to their frames, allowing drafts to penetrate freely. Wealthy households might have doors covered with leather or heavy fabric for additional insulation, but most families simply accepted that their doors would leak cold air continuously throughout winter. The central feature of most medieval homes was the hearth, the fire that provided both heat and cooking capability. In the simplest peasant cottages, this was merely a ring of stones on the earthen floor at the centre of the single room, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or simply filtering up through the thatch. This arrangement was desperately inefficient from a heating perspective, as most of the fire's heat rose straight up and escaped through the roof, along with the smoke, but it required no special construction skills or expensive materials. More sophisticated homes might have a raised hearth along one wall, with a hood of clay or plaster that directed smoke toward a chimney or wall opening. By the later Middle Ages, particularly in wealthier homes and in regions where stone was readily available, true fireplaces with chimneys became more common. These represented significant improvements in both heating efficiency and comfort, as they directed smoke out of the living space while reflecting heat back into the room from stone or brick backing. The evolution of chimney technology during the medieval period marked a significant advance in domestic comfort. Early chimneys were often external structures built against the outside of a wall, rising above the roof line to carry smoke away. Later designs incorporated chimneys within the house structure itself, where the thermal mass of the stone or brick could absorb heat from the flue gases and radiate it into living spaces even after fires had died down. However, chimneys remained rare in peasant homes throughout much of the medieval period. The construction required skilled masonry work and materials that were beyond the means of most families. Therefore, the majority of medieval Europeans continued living with smoky interiors, eyes constantly irritated by smoke that had no efficient means of escape, respiratory problems caused by breathing smoke daily throughout winter, and walls, furnishings, and everything else in the home coated with layers of soot. The fuel used for heating and cooking was almost exclusively wood throughout most of medieval Europe, supplemented in some regions by peat, a partially decomposed plant material cut from bogs and dried for use as fuel. Wood availability varied enormously across the medieval landscape, with forests providing relatively abundant supplies in some areas, while other regions faced chronic wood shortages that made fuel a constant economic burden. The amount of wood required to keep a medieval home tolerably warm throughout winter was staggering. Estimates suggest that a single household might burn through several cords of wood during a typical winter, each cord representing over 1,000 pounds of fuel. Gathering, cutting, transporting, and storing this much wood represented weeks of labour, and families that lacked access to adequate woodland resources faced genuine hardship. Different types of wood provided different heating values. Hardwoods like oak, beech, and ash burned hot and long, making them the preferred choices for both heating and cooking. Softwoods like pine and fir ignited easily but burned quickly and produced more smoke and resin deposits. Medieval families learned to recognize these differences and allocated their wood supplies strategically, saving the best hardwood for cooking while using softer woods for less critical heating needs. Peat, available in wetland regions, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, and parts of the Low Countries, provided an alternative fuel source, Cutting peat was labour-intensive work, requiring specialised tools to extract blocks from bogs, then weeks or months of drying before the peat would burn effectively. When properly dried, peat produced steady, smoky heat that could keep homes reasonably warm, though it never burned as hot as good hardwood and produced distinctive smoke that permeated everything it touched. The challenge of maintaining adequate heat throughout winter nights led to various strategies for fire management. Fires had to be kept burning continuously, as restarting a fire was difficult and time-consuming in an era before matches. Medieval people relied on flint and steel to produce sparks that could ignite tinder, dried fungus, charred cloth, or other materials that caught sparks and developed them into flames. The process required skill and could take many minutes of persistent effort, particularly if materials were damp. Therefore, fires were carefully banked at night by covering them with ash and sometimes turfs of peat or damp vegetation that would smoulder slowly throughout the night without fully extinguishing. In the morning, these banked fires could be stirred back to life by removing the covering material, adding small kindling, and blowing carefully to encourage flames. This practice meant that someone had to rise during the night to check and maintain the fire, a responsibility that typically rotated among family members. The layout of medieval homes reflected practical responses to heating challenges. The single-room dwelling, common among peasants, allowed a central fire to provide some warmth to the entire living space, though temperature gradients were extreme with heat near the fire and bitter cold near the walls and in upper sleeping areas. Families slept close together for warmth, often sharing beds or sleeping in one large bed that accommodated multiple children with parents. Wealthier families with multi-room homes faced additional heating challenges. Each room required its own heat source to be comfortable, multiplying fuel costs and labour. Therefore, many activities were concentrated in a main hall, where the primary fireplace was located, with other rooms used minimally during winter or abandoned entirely when not absolutely necessary. The development of smaller, more efficient heating devices occurred gradually during the medieval period. Braziers, metal containers that held burning charcoal, could be moved from room to provide localized heat, though they presented serious fire hazards and produced carbon monoxide that made adequate ventilation essential. Bed warmers, metal pans with long handles that could be filled with hot coals and run between bed sheets before sleep, provided brief luxury for those wealthy enough to own them. Castles and manor houses, with their stone construction and vast interior spaces, presented unique heating challenges. Stone walls, while providing excellent defense and durability, acted as thermal sinks that absorbed heat from interior fires and transmitted cold from outside. Thick castle walls stayed cold throughout winter, despite fires burning in interior chambers, creating perpetually chilly conditions that even wealthy nobles had to endure. Castle living quarters were often concentrated in a single hall for this reason, with the Great Hall serving as the primary winter living space where fires in massive fireplaces could at least partially warm the space. Private chambers were used primarily for sleeping, not for extended occupation during waking hours, and even then they were notoriously cold despite whatever fires or braziers might be maintained there. Tapestries and wall hangings, beyond their decorative functions, served practical insulation purposes by creating dead air spaces between the fabric and cold stone walls. These textiles helped reduce heat loss through walls, while also blocking drafts that penetrated through gaps in stone masonry. The famous medieval tapestries that now hang in museums originally served these humble thermal functions before being appreciated as artistic treasures. Monasteries developed some of the most sophisticated heating systems in medieval Europe, reflecting both their wealth and their need to maintain tolerable conditions for communities of dozens or even hundreds of residents. The warming room, or calefactorium, was a designated space with a large fireplace where monks could gather to warm themselves during the coldest weather. Monastic rules often limited access to this heated space, reflecting the belief that excessive comfort was spiritually dangerous, but its existence acknowledged that some warmth was necessary for human survival and productive work. Some larger monasteries developed more elaborate heating systems, including hypocaust systems inspired by Roman technology, where hot air from furnaces circulated beneath floors or through wall channels. These systems were rare and expensive to construct and maintain, but they provided more even heat distribution than fireplaces alone. The very existence of such systems demonstrated that medieval builders possessed sophisticated understanding of thermal principles when resources allowed their application. Urban housing in medieval towns and cities presented different challenges and opportunities compared to rural dwellings. Buildings were typically constructed more substantially than rural cottages, using more timber framing and sometimes stone or brick construction. Urban homes often shared walls with neighbouring structures, providing some insulation benefit from shared thermal mass, though this also meant that fires spreading from one building could quickly consume entire neighbourhoods, a constant urban danger. Urban families faced challenges in obtaining adequate fuel supplies. Wood had to be purchased from merchants who transported it from surrounding countryside, making it considerably more expensive than in rural areas where families could gather their own. This economic pressure meant that urban poor often suffered more from cold than their rural counterparts, lacking both the money to purchase adequate fuel and the space to store it even if they could afford it. Coal, which would later revolutionize heating in industrial times, was used in some medieval settings, particularly in regions like northern England where coal deposits occurred near the surface and could be mined relatively easily. However, coal was generally unpopular during most of the medieval period due to its sulphurous smoke and the intense, difficult-to-control heat it produced. Royal proclamations occasionally banned coal burning in cities due to complaints about air pollution, though these bans were often ignored by those desperate for affordable fuel. The challenge of dealing with human waste during winter when outdoor latrines became miserable to access led to various indoor solutions. Chamber pots were used universally, with their contents typically thrown into streets, into cesspits, or onto dung heaps, creating sanitation problems that medieval towns struggled to manage. Wealthier homes might have garderobe closets, small rooms built projecting from exterior walls where waste dropped through chutes into moats, rivers, or pits below. But these were cold, draughty, and hardly pleasant during winter weather. Bathing, difficult enough during warm weather given the labour required to heat water, became extremely rare during winter for most medieval people. The intense cold, the scarcity of hot water, and the risk of illness from exposure to cold air immediately after bathing meant that most people simply endured months without bathing, perhaps sponging critical areas with small amounts of heated water, but generally accepting that cleanliness would have to wait until warmer weather returned. The combination of closed-up living spaces, numerous people crowded together for warmth, smoke-filled air, and lack of bathing created conditions that promoted disease transmission in ways medieval people couldn't understand. Respiratory infections spread easily in these environments, and the general lowering of immune function caused by cold stress Inadequate nutrition and poor air quality made winter the season when illness and death rates peaked every year. Medieval builders did gradually develop improvements in domestic architecture that enhanced winter comfort. The addition of upper floors in homes created spaces where warm air could be trapped, making second-floor sleeping quarters warmer than ground-level rooms. The use of smaller, more compartmentalized rooms rather than single large halls allowed heat to be concentrated more effectively, though this also made construction more complex and expensive. The development of more efficient fireplace designs with improved draw and heat reflection represented genuine technological progress. Masons learned to angle the backs of fireplaces slightly forward to reflect more heat into rooms, to size chimneys appropriately for the fireplaces they served, and to incorporate features like warming chambers above hearths where bread could be baked or foods kept warm using heat that would otherwise escape unused. Yet despite all these improvements and adaptations, the basic reality remained that medieval homes were cold during winter by any modern standard. Temperatures inside peasant cottages might hover only slightly above freezing during the coldest weather, and even in wealthy manor houses, temperatures rarely reached levels that modern people would consider comfortable. Medieval people dressed accordingly, accepted discomfort as unavoidable, and organized their lives around the practical limitations that inadequate heating imposed on daily activities during winter months. Daily life during medieval winter contracted dramatically compared to the busy activity of warmer seasons. The short daylight hours, hostile weather, and need to conserve both energy and resources created a rhythm of existence fundamentally different from summer patterns. Understanding this altered daily routine provides insight into how medieval people actually experienced the long months of cold and darkness that dominated half their year. The medieval winter day began later than summer days, not from laziness but from practical necessity. Without artificial lighting beyond expensive candles or dim rushlights, pre-dawn activity was limited to essential tasks that couldn't wait for daylight. The first person to rise, often the woman of the household, faced the critical task of reviving the banked fire from the previous night. This process required careful work, removing ash coverings, adding small kindling, and blowing gently to encourage flames without extinguishing the remaining embers. If the fire had died completely during the night, a much more difficult process awaited. Someone would need to borrow live coals from a neighbour, or undertake the time-consuming work of striking sparks with flint and steel, catching those sparks in prepared tinder, and nursing the tiny ember into flame through careful addition of increasingly larger fuel materials. The importance of maintaining continuous fire throughout winter cannot be overstated, as each extinction meant significant labour and time lost to restart. Once the fire was restored, water could be heated for the first meal and for washing, though washing during winter was minimal. Cold water drawn from wells or streams, often requiring breaking through ice, might be used for quick face and hand cleaning, but full body washing was rare during the coldest months. Medieval people accepted that thorough cleanliness would resume when warmer weather returned, and in the meantime they managed with spot cleaning and changes of undergarments when such clothing was available. The first meal of the day, breakfast, was a simple affair for most medieval people. Leftover pottage from the previous evening might be reheated, or a simple porridge of grain boiled in water or milk provided basic sustenance. Bread, if available, might be eaten with cheese or dipped in whatever warm liquid was at hand. Wealthy households had more elaborate morning meals, but even they recognized that winter demanded conservation of resources and that simpler eating patterns helped stretch supplies. Morning work, once daylight arrived, focused on absolutely essential tasks that couldn't be avoided regardless of weather. Animals had to be tended, a responsibility that fell primarily to men and older boys. Venturing to barns or shelters where livestock waited required bundling in every available layer of clothing, as the work involved extended exposure to outdoor cold. Cattle and horses needed water, which often meant breaking ice in troughs, or leading animals to streams where ice had been chopped through. They needed fodder, precious stored hay or grain that had to be distributed carefully to make supplies last until spring grazing became possible. Chickens, if the family was fortunate enough to maintain them through winter, needed similar care. Egg production dropped dramatically during winter's short days, but the birds still required feeding and their shelters needed cleaning. The presence of chickens created vulnerability to predators, particularly foxes and other animals that became bolder and more desperate as winter progressed and wild food sources diminished. Milking cows for families that maintained dairy animals happened twice daily regardless of weather. The milk produced during winter was considerably less than summer production, reflecting the cows' reduced nutrition from stored fodder rather than fresh grass, but it remained precious for the nutrition it provided. Fresh milk spoiled quickly even in winter cold, so it typically was consumed immediately, made into simple cheese, or incorporated into cooking. Indoor work occupied the bulk of winter days, with the entire family contributing to tasks that could be performed in the relative warmth and shelter of their home. Women's work centered on textile production, a constant occupation that provided the family's clothing and sometimes produced surplus for sale or barter. Spinning wool or flax into thread was endless work performed with simple drop spindles, later with spinning wheels in wealthier households, creating the thread that would be woven into cloth. The process began long before winter, with shearing sheep in spring or summer, processing flax during autumn, but the actual spinning continued throughout winter's long evenings. Women sat near whatever heat source was available, their hands working constantly to draw out fibres and twist them into consistent thread. Work that required attention but not intense concentration, allowing for conversation, storytelling, or supervision of children while working. Weaving thread into cloth required a loom, equipment that ranged from simple frame looms for narrow bands to large floor looms capable of producing wide cloth. Only wealthier families could afford substantial looms, so poor families might weave simple items on basic equipment, or take their thread to be woven by specialists who charged for the service. The rhythmic shuttle work of weaving continued through winter days, gradually producing the cloth that would be cut and sewn into garments, bedding, or other textile goods. Sewing and mending occupied additional hours, as existing clothing required constant repair to extend its useful life. Medieval clothing, especially for poor families, was expensive relative to income, and was worn until it literally fell apart. Patches upon patches were normal, and the ability to mend skillfully was an essential household skill. Women taught daughters these skills from early childhood, creating intergenerational transmission of knowledge essential for family survival. Men's indoor winter work included tool maintenance and creation, a continuous process of repairing damaged implements and creating new ones needed for the coming agricultural season. Wooden tool handles that had cracked or broken during the previous year's work needed replacement. Metal tools needed sharpening, a skill performed with whetstones that gradually wore down blade edges to restore cutting efficiency. Some men possessed woodworking or metalworking skills that allowed them to create more complex items, providing both household utility and potentially income from selling surplus production. Basket weaving from willow or other flexible woods provided another male occupation during winter months. Baskets served countless purposes in medieval life, for carrying harvests, storing foods, transporting goods to market, and dozens of other applications. They wore out through use and needed regular replacement, making basket making a valuable skill that kept hands busy during winter's confinement. Children's roles during winter reflected their ages and capabilities. Even young children could help with simple tasks like carding wool to prepare it for spinning, a process that used small boards with wire teeth to align fibers. Older children took on more complex responsibilities, with girls learning spinning, sewing, cooking, and household management from their mothers, while boys learned tool use, animal husbandry, and various craft skills from their fathers. Education, for the small minority who received any formal instruction, often occurred during winter months when agricultural work didn't demand children's labour. Parish priests might teach basic literacy and religious instruction to select children, primarily boys from families wealthy enough to spare them from work obligations. Monasteries and cathedral schools provided more advanced education, but access was extremely limited and generally restricted to those preparing for religious vocations or from wealthy families. For most medieval children, education meant learning practical skills essential for survival, rather than literacy or abstract knowledge. Girls learned to spin, weave, sew, cook, preserve food, manage households, tend gardens, and care for younger siblings and elderly family members. Boys learned to plough, sow, harvest, care for animals, maintain tools, and perform the countless physical tasks that agricultural life demanded. This practical education happened through direct participation in family work from the earliest ages when children could make any useful contribution. Meals during winter followed patterns dictated by available stored foods and the need to conserve resources. The main meal of the day, dinner, typically occurred in the early afternoon when daylight remained and when the day's essential work had been completed. This meal centered on pottage, the thick soup or stew that was medieval Europe's most common dish. Pottage composition varied based on available ingredients, but typically included grain, typically barley, oats, or rye, vegetables from storage, and small amounts of meat, fish, or fat for flavouring. The pottage pot hung constantly over the fire with new ingredients added as needed, and the mixture evolving throughout days or even weeks. This approach maximised fuel efficiency, as the same fire that provided heat also cooked food continuously. It also meant that little food was wasted, as any edible scraps could simply be added to the pot where they would contribute to the family's nutrition. Bread, when available, accompanied most meals. The type of bread reflected social status dramatically. Wealthy families ate fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, while poor families ate dark, coarse bread made from rye, barley, or mixed grains that included all the bran and germ. In times of scarcity, bread might be extended with ground acorns, chestnuts, or even tree bark, creating products that were barely edible, but provided some substance when better options weren't available. Evening meals were lighter affairs, often consisting of leftovers from dinner, cold bread with cheese if available, or simply more pottage. The goal was to end the day with satisfied hunger, without consuming excessive stores, a constant balancing act that required careful household management. Social interaction during winter necessarily focused on immediate family and nearby neighbours, as travel was difficult and often dangerous. However, this confinement didn't mean isolation. Families gathered with neighbours for communal activities that provided both practical assistance and psychological relief from winter's monotony. Women might gather for collective spinning sessions, combining labour with conversation and mutual support. Men might coordinate to help each family with tasks requiring multiple workers, like moving heavy loads, major repairs, or butchering the occasional animal from remaining livestock. Evening entertainment was simple but important for maintaining spirits during long, dark months. Storytelling was universal, with family elders recounting tales from their youths, traditional stories passed down through generations, religious narratives from biblical sources or saints' lives, and current events from the broader world. These oral performances served educational, entertainment, and cultural preservation functions, maintaining community knowledge and values while passing time pleasantly. Music, for those with instruments and skills, provided another form of evening entertainment. Simple instruments like wooden flutes, drums made from skin stretched over frames, or fiddles created from available materials could provide music for singing or dancing even in the smallest homes. Songs range from religious hymns to work songs to bawdy ballads, reflecting the full range of medieval culture and values. Games and gambling were common pastimes, though the church officially disapproved of gambling and periodic regulations attempted to control it. Dice games were universal, played with bone dice that were simple to manufacture. Board games, including early versions of chess, checkers, and various regional games, provided entertainment for those wealthy enough to own the necessary equipment. Card games appeared later in the medieval period, after playing cards were introduced from the Islamic world, and quickly became popular despite their association with gambling and moral disapproval from religious authorities. The psychological toll of winter confinement affected medieval people despite their lifelong familiarity with the pattern. The combination of darkness, cold, limited diet, lack of physical activity, and constant proximity to the same people in cramped quarters created stresses that manifested in increased domestic tensions, depression, and sometimes violence. Records from medieval courts show increased incidents of domestic disputes and assaults during winter months, suggesting that the strain of winter living tested social bonds and individual patience. Religious observance provided structure and meaning during winter's challenges. The liturgical calendar marked time and created anticipation of coming festivals. Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, was traditionally a penitential period of fasting and preparation, adding spiritual dimension to the physical privations of winter. Christmas itself represented a major festival, a burst of celebration, special foods, and religious observance that broke the monotony of winter routine. The period from Christmas through Epiphany on January 6th constituted the 12 days of Christmas, traditionally a time of reduced work and increased celebration, when communities came together for feasting, games, and religious observances. Even poor families made special efforts to mark these days with whatever feast foods they could manage, recognizing the psychological importance of celebration during winter's depths. Candlemas on February 2nd marked another important winter festival, celebrating the presentation of Jesus at the temple, while also acknowledging that winter's end approached, though often the worst cold remained ahead. The blessing of candles at this festival provided both religious significance and practical importance, as these blessed candles were believed to offer protection against various dangers throughout the coming year. The gradual lengthening of days after the winter solstice in late December provided psychological comfort even when the coldest weather remained weeks away. Medieval people noticed and remarked on the returning light, understanding that each day brought marginally more sunlight and represented progress towards spring's eventual arrival. Clothing and textiles represented one of the most critical defences against winter cold, yet for most medieval people, the available materials and technologies imposed severe limitations on the warmth and protection that garments could provide. Understanding medieval winter clothing reveals both the ingenuity of textile production and the harsh realities of life in an era when staying warm was an expensive and labour-intensive challenge. The foundation of medieval clothing was cloth produced through the laborious process already described, spinning fibres into thread and weaving thread into fabric. The two primary textile fibres available in medieval Europe were wool and linen, each with distinct properties and uses. Wool, derived from sheep, provided the warmth essential for winter clothing. Its natural crimp created air pockets that trapped body heat, and even when wet, wool retained considerable insulating value. Linen, made from flax plants, was cooler and more comfortable against skin but provided less warmth, making it primarily suitable for undergarments and summer clothing. The quality of woolen cloth varied enormously based on the breed of sheep, the processing techniques applied, and the weaving skill involved. The finest woolens produced in specialized textile centres like Florence, Bruges, and English towns were tightly woven from carefully prepared fibres, creating cloth that was relatively soft, durable, and provided excellent protection against wind and cold. Such fine cloth was expensive, accessible only to wealthy families who could afford the considerable cost. Poor families wore much coarser woolens, often produced in their own homes from their own sheep, or purchased at lower prices from local weavers. This coarse cloth was scratchy against skin, less wind-resistant than fine woolens, and less durable, but it still provided essential warmth. The difference between fine and coarse wool wasn't merely aesthetic, but represented genuine functional differences in protection against cold. The basic garments worn by medieval people changed gradually across the centuries, but maintained certain consistent features. Men typically wore a long shirt called a chemise or shirt as their innermost garment, made of linen if possible, or of lighter wool if linen wasn't available. Over this went a tunic, a long garment reaching to the knees or below, made of wool and serving as the primary body covering. In winter, men might wear multiple tunics layered for warmth, with the outer tunic being the finest and most presentable. Leg coverings evolved during the medieval period. Early medieval men wore loose trousers or wrapped their legs with long strips of cloth that were bound with cross garters, strips of leather or cloth wound around the leg to hold the wrappings in place. Later medieval fashion introduced hose, fitted leg coverings that resembled modern tights, typically made of wool and attached to a belt around the waist. During winter, layering leg wrappings or wearing thicker hose provided additional warmth for the legs, which were particularly vulnerable to cold during outdoor work. Women's clothing followed similar layering principles. A linen chemise or smock served as the innermost garment, providing a layer that could be washed more easily than outer woolens and protecting the outer garments from body oils and perspiration. Over this, women wore one or more woolen dresses or gowns, long garments that reached to the ankles and provided the primary protection against cold. Winter dresses were made from heavier woolens and might be lined with additional layers of cloth for enhanced warmth, Both men and women wore various outer garments during cold weather. Cloaks were universal, consisting of large pieces of woolen cloth that could be wrapped around the body and secured with pins, brooches, or ties. Simple cloaks were merely rectangular pieces of cloth, while more sophisticated versions were cut and sewn to hang more gracefully and provide better coverage. The heaviest cloaks, made from thick wool and sometimes lined with fur for the wealthy, provided substantial protection against wind and cold. Fur played a crucial role in winter clothing for those who could afford it or had skills to acquire it. The medieval fur trade supplied both local needs and luxury markets, with different furs carrying different status associations. Common furs like rabbit, squirrel, and cat were accessible to fairly ordinary families and provided genuine warmth when used as linings for cloaks or trim on garments. Expensive furs like ermine, marten, and fox were luxury items restricted to wealthy families by both cost and sometimes by sumptuary laws that regulated which social classes could wear which materials. The wealthy didn't just wear more or finer clothing than the poor. They wore fundamentally different garments that provided superior protection against cold. A wealthy merchant or noble might wear a linen shirt, a woolen tunic, a more elaborate woolen cote-hardie or similar fitted garment, a surcoat or over-tunic, and a fur-lined cloak, representing 5 or 6 layers of fabric that trapped substantial warm air. By contrast, a poor peasant might have only a coarse linen or wool shirt and a single woolen tunic, with a threadbare cloak for outdoor wear, representing minimal protection against serious cold. Footwear was another area where social stratification created dramatic differences in winter comfort. Wealthy people wore leather boots or shoes that protected feet from cold and wet. The best boots were made from high-quality leather, fitted to the foot, and sometimes lined with fur or thick wool for additional warmth. Such footwear was expensive and required skilled craftsmen to produce, making it a significant investment. Poor people often wore cruder shoes made from leather scraps or even wooden clogs, simple platforms that elevated the foot above mud and snow, but provided minimal warmth or waterproofing. Some of the poorest went barefoot even during winter, suffering from frostbite and cold-related injuries that could lead to infection and death. The phrase, "the poor always with you," carried literal meaning in medieval society, where the most impoverished members genuinely lacked resources for adequate protection against the elements. Hand coverings were similarly stratified by wealth. Gloves or mittens made from leather, wool, or fur protected hands during outdoor winter work, but they were sufficiently expensive that many people couldn't afford them or owned only a single worn pair that had to be protected carefully. Working without hand protection in freezing weather caused frostbite, cracked and bleeding skin, and reduced manual dexterity that made work more difficult and dangerous. Yet many medieval people had no choice but to endure these conditions because they lacked resources for better protection. Head coverings were more universally accessible because they could be made from cloth scraps or repurposed materials. Hoods, either attached to cloaks or as separate garments, covered the head and often extended to cover the shoulders and upper chest. The hood became an iconic feature of medieval clothing, appearing in countless artistic depictions and serving essential practical functions in protecting against cold and wet. Women wore various head coverings including veils, wimples, and caps, some serving religious or social modesty functions but also providing warmth during cold weather. The challenge of keeping woolen clothing clean during winter created additional difficulties. Wool garments couldn't be washed frequently because the process required significant amounts of heated water. proper facilities for washing and rinsing, and days of drying time during which the garments couldn't be worn. Therefore, most people simply wore the same outer garments throughout winter without washing them, accepting that they would become increasingly soiled, smelly, and infested with body lice. Lice were virtually universal in medieval society, feeding on human blood and laying eggs in the seams of clothing where they were difficult to eradicate. The constant itching caused by lice was simply accepted as normal, and people picked lice from each other's hair and clothing as a routine social activity. The term nitpicking, meaning excessive focus on minor details, derives from the medieval practice of carefully searching through hair and cloth to remove nits, the eggs that lice attach to individual hairs and fibres. Undergarments could be washed more frequently than outer woolens, as linen could tolerate hot water and vigorous washing better than wool. However, even this washing was much less frequent than modern standards, perhaps once every few weeks if adequate hot water and facilities were available. The result was that medieval people lived with levels of personal dirtiness that would be considered intolerable by modern standards, contributing to skin diseases, infections, and the general burden of parasites that affected health and comfort. Bedding represented another critical textile category for winter survival. Medieval beds, for those fortunate enough to have them, consisted of wooden frames supporting some form of mattress support, either rope netting or wooden slats, topped with mattresses filled with straw, feathers, or other materials. The quality of bedding varied as dramatically as clothing based on wealth and status. Wealthy families slept on feather mattresses covered with linen sheets and woolen blankets, sometimes with fur coverlets for additional warmth. These beds might have curtains that could be drawn closed around the bed frame, creating a smaller space that trapped body heat and provided some privacy. The curtained bed became a symbol of wealth and status, appearing prominently in inventories of wealthy households. Poor families often slept on straw-filled mattress sacks placed directly on the floor or on simple wooden platforms, covered with whatever woolens or old clothing could be spared. Multiple family members shared these sleeping surfaces, combining body heat for warmth during cold nights. Children commonly slept 3 or 4 to a bed, and in the poorest families, entire families might share a single sleeping area with minimal bedding. The production of adequate clothing and bedding for a medieval family required enormous amounts of textile labour. A single woolen cloak might require wool from several sheep, months of spinning to produce sufficient thread, weeks of weaving to create the cloth, and additional time for cutting and sewing the final garment. Multiply this effort by the multiple garments needed for each family member, plus bedding and other textile goods, and the scale of labour becomes apparent. This labour fell primarily on women, whose daily spinning and weaving represented not luxuries or hobbies, but essential survival work. The spinning wheel, introduced to Europe during the later Middle Ages, increased productivity compared to hand spindles, but still required hours of work to produce modest amounts of thread. The phrase distaff side for the female line of a family derives from the distaff, the stick that held unspun fibres during the spinning process, symbolizing women's constant textile work. The economic value of textiles is reflected in medieval wills and inventories, where clothing, bedding, and cloth appear prominently among assets passed to heirs. A good woolen cloak might be specifically bequeathed to a particular child. Bed curtains and fine linens appear in wills as significant property. These weren't merely sentimental items but represented substantial economic value. that reflected the labour invested in their production. The seasonal cycle of textile production meant that much of the actual spinning and weaving happened during winter months when agricultural work was minimal. Women used the long winter evenings to produce the cloth that would be cut and sewn into garments during spring and summer, creating a continuous cycle of production that barely kept pace with the family's needs. Clothing wore out, children outgrew garments, and the constant demand for textile goods meant that production could never stop. Repair and repurposing of textiles extended their useful lives as long as possible. Worn areas of garments were patched, with patches themselves eventually being patched. Garments that could no longer serve their original purpose were cut down for children's clothing, or repurposed as cleaning rags, bandages, or stuffing for new mattresses. Nothing was wasted, as the labour investment in each piece of cloth was too valuable to discard while any use remained possible. The dyeing of cloth added colour to medieval life while also serving practical functions. Natural dyes derived from plants, minerals, and insects could produce a range of colours, though the brightest and most colour-fast dyes were expensive. Cheap dyes faded quickly and ran when wet, but even faded colour was preferable to undyed cloth for many people. Certain colours carried status associations, with bright reds, deep blues, and purple being particularly expensive and therefore restricted to wealthy families. The social signalling aspect of clothing was significant in medieval society, where sumptuary laws in many regions explicitly restricted which social classes could wear, which fabrics, colours, and styles. These laws attempted to maintain visible social hierarchies by preventing wealthy merchants or successful craftsmen from dressing as elaborately as nobles. While enforcement was inconsistent, the laws reflected the importance of clothing as markers of social status in a highly stratified society. Regional variations in clothing styles reflected both practical adaptations to different climates and cultural preferences that distinguished one area from another. Scandinavian winter clothing emphasized fur and multiple layers suitable for extreme cold. Mediterranean regions used lighter woolens and less layering, because their milder winters didn't require the heavy protection necessary in northern areas. These regional variations meant that travellers could often identify someone's origin based on clothing style and materials. The arrival of spring brought opportunities to clean and air clothing that had been worn throughout winter without adequate washing. Garments would be taken outside, beaten to remove dust and parasites, and hung in sun and fresh air to reduce odours. This spring cleaning represented an important transition point, marking the end of winter's confinement and the restoration of more normal patterns of cleanliness and comfort. Throughout all these discussions of medieval clothing, it's essential to remember that for most people, staying warm during winter was an imperfect achievement at best. Even with multiple layers, cloaks, and whatever protection could be assembled, medieval people were frequently cold. They accepted this as normal, had no alternative, and developed cultural attitudes that emphasized endurance and acceptance of discomfort that modern people would find intolerable. Social structures and community cooperation represented essential survival strategies during medieval winter, when individual families faced challenges that could overwhelm their resources and capabilities. The medieval social system, hierarchical and often exploitative, nonetheless included mechanisms for mutual support and collective action that helped communities survive the most difficult months. Understanding these social arrangements reveals how medieval people balanced self-interest with communal obligation in ways that sustained populations through repeated winters across centuries. The fundamental unit of medieval rural society was the manor, an agricultural estate controlled by a lord and worked by peasant families who held various forms of tenure on portions of the manor's land. This manorial system created relationships of mutual obligation, however unequal, between lords and peasants. Lords provided land access, some protection, and sometimes emergency support during crises. Peasants provided labour, agricultural produce, and various fees and services. These relationships shaped how communities prepared for and survived winter. The manor's agricultural land was typically divided between the lord's domain, land farmed directly for the lord's benefit, and tenant holdings farmed by peasant families for their own sustenance, while owing various obligations to the lord. The timing and nature of these obligations had to accommodate seasonal realities, including the constraints that winter imposed on agricultural work and the need for families to secure their own survival before meeting obligations to lords. Most manorial obligations were concentrated during the growing season, when labour demands peaked during ploughing, planting and harvest. Winter obligations were typically lighter, reflecting the reduced scope for productive agricultural work during cold months. However, lords still expected certain winter services, including maintaining manor buildings, cutting and hauling firewood for manor houses, and perhaps providing occasional labour for specific projects. The balance between these obligations and families' need to focus on their own winter survival created tensions that could strain the manorial relationship. One crucial function of the manorial system was maintaining communal resources that individual families couldn't provide. Mills for grinding grain into flour represented significant capital investments that required specialized knowledge to build and maintain. Most manors had mills controlled by lords, who required tenants to use these mills for a fee rather than grinding grain at home. This monopoly was often resented, but it ensured that mills were maintained and available when needed, which was particularly important during winter when properly ground flour was essential for making bread. Similarly, large ovens for baking bread were often communal resources, either maintained by the manor or shared among groups of families. Individual homes rarely had adequate facilities for baking proper bread, so families would prepare their dough at home, then take it to communal ovens for baking. This arrangement ensured efficient use of fuel while providing reliable access to baked bread, a staple of the medieval diet. The village commons, lands held collectively by the community for grazing animals and gathering wood, fuel and other resources, represented another crucial shared resource. During winter, access to common lands for gathering firewood might literally mean the difference between adequate warmth and dangerous cold. Communities developed elaborate customs regulating access to commons, specifying who could take how much wood, when gathering was permitted, and how to resolve disputes. These regulations reflected accumulated wisdom about sustainable resource use that prevented any individual from depleting resources needed by all. The institution of gleaning, the practice of allowing poor people to gather grain left in fields after harvest, represented a form of structured charity that helped ensure that the poorest community members had at least minimal food supplies. After the main harvest was completed and the lord and tenant farmers had taken their shares, poor people could enter fields to gather overlooked grain. The amounts gathered through gleaning were small, but for desperately poor families they represented crucial additions to winter food supplies. Religious institutions provided another layer of social support during winter. The Catholic Church taught that charity was a religious obligation, and monasteries, parish churches, and religious confraternities all participated in distributing food, fuel, and sometimes clothing to the poor during winter months. Monastic communities often maintained designated supplies for charitable distribution, with almoners responsible for identifying needy recipients and distributing resources according to established criteria. Parish churches collected tithes, a tax of 1/10 of agricultural produce, which theoretically was supposed to support clergy and maintain churches, but also provided some resources for poor relief. The actual implementation varied widely, with some parishes providing substantial support to poor parishioners, while others devoted most resources to clergy support and church maintenance. Nonetheless, the principle that religious institutions had obligations to the poor created at least some safety net for the most vulnerable. Guilds in medieval towns and cities provided mutual support for their members, including help during difficult winters. Craft guilds and merchant guilds collected dues from members and maintained funds that could be drawn upon to support members who fell on hard times due to illness, injury, or other misfortune. Guild regulations often specified that members should visit sick colleagues, assist widows and orphans of deceased members, and provide financial support when members couldn't work due to circumstances beyond their control. These guild support systems were limited to members and didn't extend to the broader urban poor who lacked guild affiliation. However, for those within guild protection, these mutual aid societies provided genuine security during winter and other difficult periods. The knowledge that illness or injury wouldn't immediately result in destitution allowed guild members to face winter with greater confidence than non-guild urban residents who lacked such protections. Confraternities, religious organizations of lay people devoted to particular saints or religious purposes, also provided mutual support among members. These organizations, which existed in both towns and rural areas, combined religious devotion with practical mutual aid. Members contributed to common funds and agreed to help each other during emergencies. During winter, confraternities might organize collective activities like processing firewood, checking on elderly or sick members, or arranging for communal meals that allowed resources to be shared efficiently. Family networks extending beyond individual households represented another crucial support structure. Medieval families maintained connections with extended relatives, creating networks of obligation and mutual assistance that could be activated during emergencies. A family facing severe hardship during winter might send children to live temporarily with better situated relatives, reducing the burden on depleted food supplies while ensuring the children received adequate nutrition. Elderly parents might move between adult children's households, sharing the burden of care among multiple families. These family support networks also functioned for sharing resources and labor. Families with surplus food might provide loans or gifts to struggling relatives, expecting reciprocal generosity when circumstances reversed. Families with particular skills or resources might share them with relatives, creating informal economies of exchange that operated alongside formal markets and complemented limited cash resources available to most medieval people. The practice of hospitality, both religious obligation and social custom, provided another support mechanism during winter. Travellers caught by winter weather expected to find shelter in monasteries, manor houses, or private homes along their routes. While this hospitality was sometimes abused and could burden hosts, it represented a crucial safety valve that prevented travellers from freezing to death when weather prevented them from reaching their intended destinations. Community work parties represented collective labour arrangements that allowed major tasks to be accomplished more efficiently than individual families could manage. During the autumn preparation period, groups of families might coordinate to help each household complete essential tasks like bringing in harvests, slaughtering animals, and cutting firewood. These work parties continued during winter for tasks requiring multiple workers, like moving heavy loads, major repairs, or emergency responses to fires or storm damage. The social dimension of these work parties was as important as the labour accomplished. Working together reinforced community bonds, provided opportunities for socialising that broke the monotony of winter confinement, and created networks of reciprocal obligation that bound families together in mutual dependence. A family that received help understood they were obligated to provide help in return, creating webs of mutual support that sustained communities through difficult periods. Marriage alliances between families created additional bonds that functioned as support networks. When families negotiated marriages for their children, they considered not just the immediate economic arrangements of dowries and inheritances, but also the longer-term benefits of alliance with particular families. These marriage alliances created obligations between in-laws that could be activated during emergencies, providing access to resources, support, or assistance when needed. Conflict resolution mechanisms helped maintain community cohesion during winter months when tensions could escalate due to confinement and stress. Village assemblies or manor courts provided forums for resolving disputes over property boundaries, resource access, debts, and interpersonal conflicts. While these institutions were hardly perfect and often reflected existing power hierarchies, they provided alternatives to violent feuds that could tear communities apart. The Christmas season and other winter festivals served important social functions beyond their religious significance. These gatherings brought communities together during the darkest, coldest period of the year, reinforcing social bonds and providing psychological relief from winter's hardships. Even poor families made efforts to participate in community celebrations, recognizing that maintaining social connections was as essential as maintaining physical resources for successful winter survival. Lords of manors sometimes provided Christmas feasts for their tenants, a practice that reinforced social hierarchies while also demonstrating the lord's largesse and creating goodwill within the community. These feasts might include foods rarely available to peasant families, special entertainments, and temporary relaxation of some normal social restrictions. While these gestures didn't erase the fundamental inequalities of medieval society, they created moments of shared celebration that helped maintain social stability. The concept of the moral economy operated during winter and other difficult periods, creating expectations that those with resources had obligations to share with those in need, not from pure charity, but from recognition that community survival required some redistribution. Communities might pressure wealthy families to provide employment during winter, to sell grain at reasonable rather than exploitative prices during shortages, or to open their resources for community use during emergencies. Failure to meet these expectations could result in social ostracism, property damage, or even riots in extreme cases. Women's networks provided particularly important support systems during winter. Women working together on textile production, food preparation, or childcare created bonds that transcended individual households. These networks facilitated sharing of knowledge about medical care, food preservation, child rearing, and countless other practical matters essential for household survival. When families faced crises like illness or death, women's networks mobilized to provide care, food preparation, child supervision, and emotional support that helped families survive disruptions that might otherwise have been catastrophic.